Good evening and welcome to this evening's panel discussion on the topic Islam, Constitutions, and Durable Democracy. One of our panelists, Robert George, is stuck in traffic, but he's on his way and we've left room for him at the end of the table. This event is sponsored by the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs here at Georgetown, and also by the Prince Al-Walid bin Talal Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding. My name is Tom Banshoff. I'm director of the Berkeley Center. We're entering our second year of programming now. And we're part of a university-wide effort together with partners like the Prince Al-Walid Center to make Georgetown a global leader in the interdisciplinary study of religion and its role in world affairs, and to help in the promotion of interreligious understanding. As you can imagine, there's plenty of work to go around in this area. I invite you to stay tuned, sign up for our mailing list. We have some great events coming up this semester and next. Tonight's panel on a very topical issue and on a very important anniversary is made possible by a grant from the Henry Luce Foundation to the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service. The Luce SFS program, now in its second year, has as one of its themes the relationship between religion, domestic politics, and foreign policy. And there are a few cases where that relationship is more important, more fascinating, and more complex than the cases of Afghanistan and Iraq. It's now my pleasure to turn things over to my colleague, Dr. Thomas Farr, who will be introducing the panel, introducing the topic, and who's also organized tonight's program. Tom is a visiting professor within the Luce program this year. He's one of the world's leading experts on the global politics of religious freedom. Tom served as the first director of the State Department's Office of International Religious Freedom from 1999 to 2003, and is now completing a book entitled World of Faith and Freedom: Why Religious Liberty is Vital to American National Security in the 21st Century, to be published with Oxford University Press. Here at Georgetown, Tom is teaching 2 courses around these themes: a career diplomat with a long history of distinguished service. He's also taught both at West Point and at the U.S. Air Force Academy. Tom, we're thrilled to have you on board this year, and with that, I turn the program over to you.
Thank you, Tom. For years, the American people have debated the wisdom and folly of U.S. policies in Iraq and Afghanistan, a debate which has centered, as you know, over the last couple of days in Congress. I'm delighted to tell you that we are not going to resolve that debate tonight. We're not even going to try and resolve that debate tonight, although I dare say someone will have something to say about U.S. policy. What we are going to talk about is one of the keystones of success for both the Iraqi and Afghan democratic experiments, namely their respective constitutions. Although the war has garnered much of our attention in recent years, justifiably, it's important to remember that Iraq and Afghanistan are nascent democracies. Both have governments elected by levels of voter participation, including large numbers of women, that put most American elections to shame. Both have active legislative bodies and independent judiciaries, although how active and how independent remains lively issues. Both have democratic constitutions, brokered with the assistance of the United States, although the role of American assistance is, you will not be shocked to learn, controversial. Our focus tonight is those 2 constitutions. If the Iraqi and Afghan democratic experiments are to succeed, these 2 documents must play an important role. They are, if you will, the blueprints for democratic institutions and democratic habits. A major question we want to engage tonight is the extent to which constitutions can encourage a democratic political culture and do it under the difficult conditions that exist in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's perhaps obvious that constitutions cannot solve all problems. They can't, for example, rebuild the associations of civil society that were destroyed by Saddam Hussein or the Taliban. Although they can help create the rights and freedoms necessary to the rebuilding of civil society. By the same token, constitutions cannot prevent civil war or stop them once they've begun. Even the American Constitution could not prevent a civil war. But it's also true that democracies, even peaceful ones, are unlikely to endure without constitutions that allocate powers and protect rights and freedoms in ways that are not only democratic, but that are culturally and politically sustainable. Do the Iraqi and Afghani constitutions have the potential to meet such expectations? We've asked our panelists to consider the importance of constitutions in general, these two constitutions in particular, especially their provisions on Islam, religious freedom, and the judiciary. To examine these questions, we've gathered together a fascinating panel of experts. And to paraphrase an Oldsmobile commercial, this is not your father's panel on Islam and democracy. It's a discussion that features, on the one hand, two of the country's leading Muslim experts on Islamic culture and jurisprudence, and on the other, two of the country's leading Catholic experts on constitutions, human rights, and religious freedom. In short, we're putting these constitutions under scrutiny from two separate religious worldviews that are different in obvious ways, but which will also, I suspect, intersect in important ways as well. So let me introduce our panelists in the order in which they will speak tonight. Please hold your applause until I've introduced them all. First, William L. Saunders, Jr. is Senior Fellow in Human Rights Council at the Family Research Council here in Washington. A graduate of Harvard Law School, he has worked with the Lawyers Committee for Human Rights, specializing in human rights and religious liberty. He's Vice Chair for Religious Liberty for the Federalist Society and a member of the Board of Advisors for the Center of Law, Philosophy, and Culture at the Catholic University of America. I don't know if you've heard of the Catholic University of America here at Georgetown. Secondly, Muqtedar Khan is Assistant Professor of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Delaware. He earned his PhD in International Relations, Political Philosophy, and Islamic Political Thought from Georgetown University. Dr. Khan is also associated with the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy and the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. He's been the President, Vice President, and General Secretary of the Association of Muslim Social Scientists. Third, we will have Intisar Rabb, who sits to my left, who received her JD from the Yale Law School and is a PhD candidate at Princeton University, where she focuses on comparative American and Islamic legal interpretation. Most recently, she served as a law clerk to the Honorable Judge Thomas Farr of the United States Courts of Appeal for the Third Circuit. And this year, she's a fellow at Princeton University's Center for Human Values. Intisar is a 1999 graduate of Georgetown University with an honors degree in government and Arabic. And last, and still not here, and certainly not least, but hopefully showing up in a few minutes, is Professor Robert P. George, McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence and founder and director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University. A graduate of Harvard Law School, he is a member of the President's Council on Bioethics and previously served as a presidential appointee to the United States Commission on Civil Rights. Professor George is a former judicial fellow at the Supreme Court of the United States, where he received the Justice Tom C. Clark Award. In short, ladies and gentlemen, we have two Muslim scholars educated at a Jesuit institution and two Catholic scholars trained at Harvard. That phenomenon might warrant its own conference. Would you please greet our panelists tonight? And we will now begin with Mr. Saunders.
As Tom mentioned, we're looking at several questions, including constitutions generally and the specific constitutions in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I want to make a few general remarks about constitutions and then some about the specific constitutions. Certainly, establishing democracy is difficult in countries like Iraq and Afghanistan, where divisions are very deep and there's a recent history of violence in dealing with those differences. I think it's a fair question whether or not such societies are ready for democratic constitutional governance. It's surely true that constitutions cannot force democratic governance on people. If people do not want it, it will not happen. Still, constitutions provide a framework and hopefully breathing space in which people can recognize their mutual equality as human beings and consequently the need for shaping by fair rules their life together. It's also true that constitutions can set a framework for a mutually respectful exchange of views, which hopefully leads to religious reconciliation or at least peaceful coexistence. Certainly in the two cases mentioned, American diplomacy should, in my opinion, actively and determinedly encourage exchanges between leaders of the various religious groups in order to find common ground and to build a society together. However, this does not appear to have been the emphasis of U.S. diplomacy, regrettably. Now, regarding the two constitutions themselves, Iraq and the Afghan constitutions, each has provisions that what are called repugnancy clauses, saying that nothing that prohibit any law from being contrary to the established provisions of Islam or the sacred religion of Islam. Now, it seems there's nothing wrong in principle with a constitution acknowledging either that the vast majority of a particular country holds a particular religious view or that a particular religion has been very influential in shaping the culture. As an analogy, Catholicism has recognized that there can be, at least on the typical European model, an established church, but crucially, only if individuals are not coerced as a result. The question for the Iraqi and Afghan constitutions is whether they protect the right of the individual not to be coerced in matters of religion. The right to be free from coercion is also a principle recognized in international human rights legal instruments. Now, as Tom alluded to, both these constitutions provide for some level of religious freedom. How effective are those guarantees? Let me say, first of all, that I think religious freedom is the most important question for the consolidation of democracy in these countries or in any country. Religion is a human good. Human beings cannot flourish if they are denied the freedom to seek God. Of course, when you have a diversity of persons seeking God, they are going to come to a diversity of conclusions. But these varying religious beliefs that come about as a result must be respected. Once again, coercion must be avoided. Thus, since democracy's fundamental premise is equality among its citizens, if the religious freedom of some is suppressed, democracy will wither. The corollary is also true, I believe, where religious freedom is permitted, and this includes freedom not only to worship, but to take religiously informed opinions into the public square, citizens are likely to understand that respect for democratic values and institutions is essential to the common good. Tensions will erupt, but democratic procedures provide ways of resolving those tensions. And as I understand my charge from Tom, is to make some allusion to some thoughts in the history of Catholic thought on this and also to American history. So I just want to quote to you briefly from Democracy in America by Tocqueville. In America, this is quoting, in America it is religion that leads to enlightenment and the observance of divine laws that leads to liberty. American civilization is the product, and one should continually bear in mind this point of departure, of two distinct elements, which elsewhere have often been at war with one another, but which in America it was somehow possible to incorporate into each other, forming a marvelous combination. I mean the spirit of religion and the spirit of freedom. Thus, in the moral world, now Tocqueville is going to go on and explain why this has worked in America and hopefully suggest how it could work in other places. Thus, in the moral world, everything is classified, coordinated, foreseen, and decided in advance. In the world of politics, everything is in turmoil, contested, and uncertain. Far from harming each other, these two apparently opposed tendencies work in harmony and seem to lend moral support. Religion regards civil liberty as a noble exercise of man's faculties, politics being the sphere intended by the Creator for the free play of intelligence. Religion, being free and powerful in its own sphere and content with the role reserved for it, realizes that its sway is all the better established because it relies upon its own power and rules men's hearts without external support. Freedom sees religion as the companion of its struggles and triumphs, the cradle of its infancy, and the divine source of its rights. Religion is considered the guardian of mores, and mores are regarded as the guarantee of the laws and the pledge for the maintenance of freedom itself. Now, we know American history has had plenty of difficulties with religious freedom. As Tom Farr has reminded me, in the 1600s, Mary Dyer was hanged in Boston because she was a Quaker. But yet, 130 years later, we have the Bill of Rights to the U.S. Constitution guaranteeing religious freedom. So I don't mean to suggest that this is an achievement easily, lightly, or even guaranteed to be won, but it shows you, I think, that in America, where there was this great diversity of sects, a lot of different points of view, sometimes we kind of think, sometimes some of us think all Protestants are basically the same. Well, you know, if you know American history, it isn't. They were hanging each other, and they had no use for each other. So the religious tolerance that was achieved is quite an achievement, and hopefully suggestive and helpful for us. Also, in Catholic intellectual history, we have the document of the Second Vatican Council, Dignitatis Humanae, and it we don't need to get into the Catholic argument about whether it's a development of doctrine or new doctrine or whatever. But what it does is it lays out the principle of religious freedom in civil affairs, and it does it on the idea that each person, as a reflection of their Creator, has great inherent dignity, and that dignity has to be respected, and nobody's conscience can be coerced. Dignitatis also goes on. I want to allude to one thing that's sometimes not talked about, is it believes that this results in the creation of good citizens, that the exchange of ideas and discussion results in the creation of a more civil society itself. Let's see. I've lost my quotation. Let me... Okay. It says that when men and women seek God according to their own conscience, it says, men, in other words, this produces men, in other words, who will come to decisions on their own judgment and in the light of truth, govern their activities with a sense of responsibility, and strive after what is true and right, willing always to join with others in cooperative efforts. Religious freedom, therefore, ought to have this further purpose and aim, namely, that men may come to act with greater responsibility in fulfilling their duties in community life. So the argument from Dignitatis Humanae is that, in fact, you will have a stronger society if you have religious freedom that will lead to the creation of better citizens and cooperation among them. It doesn't appear to me that the constitutions of either of these two constitutions effectively protect the right to religious freedom. Afghanistan's constitution is particularly restrictive, guaranteeing only, quote, followers of other faiths than Islam shall be free within the bounds of law in the exercise and performance of their religious rituals, end quote. So it may be a religious freedom that's restricted only to the performance of rituals, may not go any further than that. But Iraq's constitution also has several problems regarding religious freedom. I'm not going to get into them all now, but I want to mention one of them, and it has to do with the judiciary. In my opinion, a judiciary is key to a well-functioning democracy. However, in each of these two constitutions, it appears that members of the high judicial courts may be selected who lack training in civil law. If this fact is combined, as it is in these two constitutions, with broad clauses guaranteeing that laws may not be repugnant to Islam, as I read you a couple minutes ago, it opens the possibility for an interpretation of constitutional provisions at variance with basic human rights and contrary to the good of human persons and communities. In other words, it opens a way for coercion to be exercised upon religious minorities and even, of course, upon Muslims who do not subscribe to every tenet of Islam, as happened, for instance, in Afghanistan, actually during the transition when the new Women's Affairs Minister was formally charged with a crime of blasphemy. Now, if members of society, including, of course, Muslims themselves, cannot speak freely about how to translate Islamic principles into everyday rules of governance, it seems to me that democracy cannot take root. It is true, of course, that limits may be placed on religious matters if they threaten what the Catholic Church in Dignitatis Humanae calls public order. But such restrictions must be understood narrowly and must be clearly stated. In other words, the emphasis should be upon religious freedom, which contributes mightily to the common good for all members of a society. Thank you.
Professor Khan.
Good evening, and assalamu alaikum to all of you. I want to thank Tom and Tom for organizing this event. And I have attended many events in this room, so I feel at home. And because I feel at home, I must confess that I have issues. I have several issues about the nature of this discussion itself. My first issue is that we seem to be supposing, there seems to be an underlying assumption that liberal democracy is a good idea to begin with. And there's no need to contest this at all. It's as if it is revealed by God. Who would question the word of God? Not only that it is a good idea, but also that it is desirable by everybody in the world. And if you don't desire this order, there's something wrong with you fundamentally. So this assumption seems to be underlying this whole notion. And I think it is problematic because this liberal democracy did not prevent America from becoming the most hated nation on earth. Go look at your statistics. If you don't believe me, look at Pew Studies data and find out which is the country which is most hated on earth today. It is the champion of liberal democracy. Not only that, this constitution of ours has not prevented, in fact, this constitution is stamped by a man who has poor memory. And it has not prevented us from passing acts such as the Patriot Act, which can fundamentally undermine the same values that the Constitution. So the idea that liberal democracy in an institutional form will necessarily lead to a good political order is questioned by several things which have been going on in the past few years. But also, why do we need to promote this order overseas when we are rejecting it at home? The failure of Europeans to pass the European Constitution is an indication that liberal ideas are no more welcome in the liberal West. In fact, in this country, liberal itself is a dirty word. You could be happy to tap dance in a toilet and survive, but better not be called a liberal. You're finished politically in this country. It's fascinating, and yet we want to export the same ideas overseas. That the new composition of the American Supreme Court is going to be, in many ways, an instrument which is going to subvert the liberal order in this country and probably globally for a long time to come. So the question really, that's my first issue, why promote a liberal order? Don't misunderstand me. I'm a strong believer of these values, but I'm asking you the question as to why we are focusing elsewhere when it's being rejected at home. Secondly, to talk about constitutionalism in the context of Iraq and Afghanistan to me is problematic because we seem to be legitimizing an imperial agenda. I think this whole enterprise, from the beginning, A to Z, is a crime against humanity. We should not talk about it as if it will lead to something good to begin with. The United States had just cause to go to Afghanistan. The US has no more reason to occupy Afghanistan, after having established the fact that bin Laden has reconstituted himself in Pakistan. We are in Afghanistan because we are using a country as a forward base, that is all. Number three, we have to also ask ourselves the question, are we talking about Muslim societies, Arab societies, Malaysian societies, South Asian societies, and their compatibility with constitutionalism, liberal democracy, democratic order, or are we talking about Islam per se? Because the only two things that are common between Afghanistan and Iraq is Islam and US occupation. There's nothing else common between these two countries. So if you're talking about Islam, democracy, and constitutionalism, then perhaps it would be more useful to look at the constitutions and the struggles that people in Malaysia, in Pakistan, in Turkey, and Iran have had. In fact, Iran is probably the best case study because in 1908, they voluntarily, spontaneously opted for a democratic constitution, and in 1979, they also spontaneously adopted for an Islamic constitution. Iran would be a great case study to understand the compatibility of Muslim societies, Islamic culture, and Islamic theology with democracy. One more reason why we need not talk about, we cannot have a meaningful dialogue about constitutionalism in the context of Iraq and Afghanistan is because these are not countries. They do not have sovereignty. The most important thing that countries have, the constitutive principle that makes a country is sovereignty. If you don't have it, you are not a country. It's like men without manhood. And therefore, it is difficult to talk about what is going to be the future of these countries. Constitutions per se do not have agency. They are not agents. They cannot shape political reality. At best, constitutions are the codification of a popular will. When constitutions become the codification of a popular will, then they are useful, they are meaningful, they are powerful. They are never causal. They are always consequence. This is really very important for us to understand this. When the American public will fully realize the absurdity of the legal changes that the United States has undergone, they will use the American Constitution to reject all of these things and say these are unconstitutional measures later on. But right now, they have all been passed, and the political will of the people is at odds with the American Constitution, so it is a meaningless document. This is an important thing to understand. And therefore, the question is, are the Iraqi constitutions and Afghan constitutions a measure of the political will of these people? I beg to differ. I don't think they are. In fact, if you read those documents, they are very idiotic in nature. The preamble of the Iraqi constitution is so childish. We are the greatest people on earth. Great. We are Arabs, we are this, we are that. Who writes this stuff in the Constitution? I haven't seen any other constitution just spending 1.5 pages of self-glorification. It's full of contradictions. People say that a camel is a horse designed by a committee. This is a very good example of a camel, especially the Iraqi constitution. I can imagine Zalmay Khalilzad saying, you have to have a clause on freedom of religion. You have to have a clause on democracy. Your constitution cannot be anti-democracy. We occupy you, remember? And the guy says, that's right, but we're not going to sit here and listen to you if you don't allow us to put in Islam. If you don't have Islam, we are walking away. Then you can deal with Muqtedar Sadr. And they say, okay, so we'll have your part and our part. So it's like a compromise document. If they had approached this issue seriously, the issue that they should have discussed was to come to a consensus whether Islam and democracy are compatible. If there was at least one preamble statement which says that we believe that Islam and democracy are not incompatible, then the constitutions would become meaningful and there would be protection from future chaos. For example, the Iraqi constitution says that there will be no law passed which is contradictory to Islam. There will be no law passed which is contradictory to democracy and gender issues. Unless people claim that there is no contradiction between democratic processes and what is the Sharia, there are specific items in the Sharia which specifically contradicts items that we would associate with a democratic order, such as gender equality, such as the equality of Muslims and non-Muslims. Can non-Muslims be head of state? If you say that you can't have an Islamic law, a law that does not contradict Islamic Sharia, you cannot have a non-Muslim head of state. So what has it been done? It's a document that does not have any value unless there's a political will of the people to preserve these things. That is really important. It's not easy to become a democracy. The US has been struggling for 200 years to become a democracy. And there should be thousands of people who know what these things mean, believe in these things, and work for it every day in local communities on national levels, and that is completely missing. There is some legitimacy to what happened in Afghanistan because of the Jirga process. The Loya Jirga was employed to have some kind of a... If these constitutions are not recognized as social contracts, and that is a problem. That is a question that General Petraeus could not answer in the last 2 days, whether people are accepting this constitution, which is not happening in Iraq today. Coming back to the question of Islam and democracy, I think that if we are talking about Islam, then we are on firmer grounds than if you're talking about any of the specific Muslim countries. Islamic tradition on democracy is much more stronger than the record of individual Muslim countries. The first Islamic state established by the Prophet in Medina, peace be upon him, was based on a social contract. In fact, 2 social contracts. He's like Pufendorf, who said that in order to create society, you need 2 constitutions. First, social contracts, which makes us a community, and then the second, which makes us a state. The first social contract got the people of Medina backing the Prophet. The second social contract made him in charge of the state and affairs of the state of Medina. But what is interesting about the Constitution of Medina, by virtue of which Prophet Muhammad governed Medina, was number 1, that he did not rule Medina because he was a prophet of God, but he ruled by the consent of the people that he was ruling. They gave him consent through these 2 constitutions which they signed on to. Number 2, it's multi-religious, where all religious groups have equal status as religious groups. The notions of dhimmitude, which is now much talked about, the issues of what unequal rights Muslims may have with non-Muslims, does not exist in that specific constitution. Number 3, it also talks about religious freedom for each religious group by recognizing it as autonomous religious entity, which means neither the state nor Muslim scholars will interpret the religion of a particular community for them. Thereby, they are free to practice their religion as they choose, and the state will guarantee them this right. No, that is an important history. We can talk about it. If you're talking in the context of Islam and democracy, you can take that and convince people. Ironically, today, Iraq is a less secular state than it was under Saddam Hussein. And the Taliban did not need a constitution to Islamize Afghanistan. I also want to leave you with a couple of comments about the Muslim world. There is a huge difference between the pre-colonial Muslim world and the post-colonial Muslim world. And we must understand this lack of self-confidence, this lack of continuity of identity and knowledge has devastated the Muslim world. It is like a 70-year-old boxer trying to go back and win the world championship again. It doesn't happen. You have to go back and resuscitate your strength. The Muslim world today, the shadow of what it was in the past, they don't even know their own tradition, and they are rejecting the Western traditions without knowing what it is. And in this context, it is impossible. Any attempts to us even to sell them good ideas are going to backfire. And therefore, it becomes very important for us to recognize that there is an authentic tradition and there is a synthetic process. And so even in order for us to see good happen in the Muslim world, we should not be oppressive. I do believe that there is enough in the authentic traditions of Islam which will make democracy and constitutionalism welcome in the Muslim world if they have security. Remember, one attack on us and we became so insecure that we are willing to move away from constitutions. The Muslim world is attacked routinely. Everybody attacks Muslim world. Russians bomb them, India bombs them, Israel bombs them, America bombs them. And under these conditions of insecurity, it's impossible to accept them, to live up to the liberal ideals that we are ready to reject today. Thank you.
I want to start by thanking the organizers for inviting me here and putting together this panel. I think this is an important question to talk about because this is, for all intents and purposes, what comes next if and when security comes. So I want to start off by asking you to imagine a few images, and maybe for the students amongst you, this will be a help to you in term papers where you're asked to write a certain amount of words. Because they say a picture speaks 1,000 words, so maybe after describing 4 pictures or so, I'll have filled my speaking quota, and when you're writing these papers, you'll have filled your writing requirement. When people think of ancient Iraq and Afghanistan, they conjure an image of a dust-blown landscape, perhaps, with a religious monument at its center. And to the extent that this image fits within the pre-modern view of religion at the center of government and society, then I would suggest that this is an image that evokes the past of Iraq and Afghanistan. I've spoken about this a similar topic before, recently at a school in California, and the advertisement there had a picture of flames from a recently detonated bomb. In my mind, this spoke to the grim view of the present, the conflict against American troops and against internally warring factions. And today's web advertisement, I'm not sure if it's on the paper advertisement, but at least the web advertisement for today's event depicts the scales of justice as we contemplate Islam, constitutions, and durable democracy. I think that is a fitting image for the future. It's an ideal that is not yet realized, and the possibility of which we, of course, are discussing today. So those are 3 images, past, present, and future. And the 4th is one that I think cuts across Iraq and Afghanistan's shared Islamic past, plays an integral role toward the resolution of the present in these 2 countries, and will be key for the future success of these countries. So this picture begins in 2003 when Coalition Provisional Authority head Paul Bremer vowed to veto any constitution in the interim period that incorporated Islamic law as its main source. So the leading Iraqi jurist, Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani, directly countered this, insisting not only on the incorporation of Islamic law into the constitution, but also that no law should contradict Islamic law. So then the image really is one of 2 leaders, one American-led, one indigenous to Iraq from its juristic class, standing off on a world political stage in a war of wills over the proper fate of Iraq's new constitutional state. Both had drawn lines in the sand. Ayatollah Sistani, in this case, won. The transitional constitution incorporated Islamic law, as did the permanent one, ratified shortly thereafter, with even with strengthened language from the transitional constitution. So now the article in question reads, and this is Article 2, Islam is the official religion of the state and a basic source of legislation. No law can be passed that contradicts settled Islamic legal rules, called Thawabit Ahkam al-Islam, settled Islamic legal rules. So it doesn't use the word Sharia, but it definitely refers to Islamic law in a rather unique way. This doesn't appear in any other constitution. Sistani's victory revealed the latent and not inconsiderable power and legitimacy that Iraqi jurists enjoy. This would have been perhaps expected by anyone observing with some knowledge of religion and politics in the region. And in fact, one scholar, Harvard professor Roy Mutahide, nearly predicted as much when he commented about Sistani in 2003. So this is before either of these incidents had happened, before the writing of the Constitution, before the standoff between Paul Bremer and Sistani. So Mutahide wrote, "No other Iraqi mullah possesses his learning or piety, and he has more followers in the Twelver Shiite world than any other source of imitation alive. It will be very hard and possibly unwise to build a new Iraq without allowing some of the Shiite clergy to participate." This professor was speaking strategically and with historical perspective, for Iraqi jurists are and have been a strong independent body with a centuries-long legacy of intellectual activity and institutional development, particularly in the Shi Learning Center where Ayatollah Sistani sits, or Najaf. So it is perhaps for this reason, finally recognizing this, that Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki went to meet with Sistani last week to discuss the future of the Iraqi parliament even. So these are getting to issues beyond purely Islamic law. But as I will explain, the power of the jurists in Iraq, and I'm focusing on Iraq here just as an example, and I think this, the same sort of analysis extends to Afghanistan in some ways. But the power of the jurists is not absolute, and it must somehow fit within the overall constitutional scheme for Islamic constitutionalism to work in either Iraq or Afghanistan. So I want to move next to talking about the tensions that do exist within the constitution, within the Iraqi constitution, again, as an illustrative example. The constitutional clauses that incorporate Islamic law must be read alongside the other key clauses of these constitutions, and that's where we get the democracy coming in side by side with Islamic norms. Together, these clauses set up the basic tensions with which each Islamic constitutional country must grapple. So in the Iraqi constitution, there are three types of provisions. The first is religion and Islamic law, provisions related to religion and Islamic law. And I've just read to you the main article on that. And again, I'll read it again, Article 2.2a. Islam is the official religion of the state and a basic source of legislation. No law can be passed that contradicts settled Islamic legal rules. Secondly, there are clauses on basic rights and freedoms. And there are two principal clauses. One, Article 2c, no law can be passed that contradicts the basic rights and freedoms outlined in this Constitution. So notice that that mirrors the repugnancy clause on the Islamic law side. Article 14 says that Iraqis are equal before the law without discrimination on the basis of gender, ethnicity, nationality, origin, color, religion, sect, or legal school, belief, opinion, or social and economic status. And the third type of provision relates to democratic processes. And again, there are two main ones here. Article 2b, no law can be passed that contradicts the principles of democracy. Again, we have this repugnancy clause, this time for democracy. In Article 5, the law is sovereign and the people are the sources of power and their legitimacy. So predictably, the Iraqi Constitution's clauses on religion stand in some tension to the clauses on rights and democratic processes, and in part I think that this tension is a regular feature even of old constitutions that both recognize a role for religion and prohibit religious discrimination through a liberal democratic promise of equality. So for example, EU member nations, Finland, Greece, and the UK each established some form of Christianity as its official state religion. And at the same time, the constitutions or laws of each country also contain provisions for equality and rights of their citizens, regardless of religious affiliation. In these countries, the state must ensure that the established religion does not impinge on the freedoms of any of its citizens, and that religion will never impede fair democratic processes. In the United States, of course, with which we are most familiar, handles a religion-state problem with the First Amendment's twin establishment and free exercise clauses and a host of other statutes and court decisions interpreting that. So Iraq faces the challenge of what to do with religion in the face of democracy. So its constitution structurally is close to that of the United States and these other countries that seek to balance religious freedoms with liberal democratic norms, while in some cases recognizing the role of a state religion, though not establishing it. And to be sure, Iraq has an added challenge in that its constitution not only establishes or recognizes a state religion, but it incorporates a legal system of religious origin as a source of state law. So the consequences of this added challenge is that the Constitution will depend very much on who interprets. And so, of course, when we're talking about lawmaking and who interprets and who legislates, we think of the three branches of government, the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. Typically, we won't think of the executive as having much of a direct role in legislation. So I'll focus on the legislature and the judiciary briefly. So as far as the legislature, I want to talk about one event that happened, again, in Iraq. And in doing so, note that the legislature and codification are important considerations for this question of Islamic constitutionalism. There are key considerations, particularly in the case of Islamic law, where Islamic law traditionally was not a codified legal system. It was a legal system that had sources of law that was constantly interpreted by jurists to whom individual petitioners would come and ask questions of. So experiences of other countries in the region differ, but most have codified Islamic family laws. And that's where the locus of Islamic law has been placed, as countries, even Islamic constitutional countries, by and large replaced their previous regimes under the Ottoman Empire with British and French laws mainly. But family law in particular remain the domain of Islamic law. So some have predicted that with the advent of Islamic constitutionalism, Islamic family law in Iraq would be uncodified and left exclusively in the hands of the jurists. And then the fear was that the jurists would impose restrictions on women's marriage and divorce rights. They'd keep them from driving, and a host of other things. So Iraq does not seem to be on that path. And so the little anecdote that I wanted to share has to do with something called Resolution 137, which was a proposal to replace Iraq's Islamic family law code with Sharia, quote unquote, which was simply defined as uncodified or conceived of as uncodified law, interpreted exclusively by local jurists and clerics. So this Resolution 137 was proposed but failed. Apparently, women activists played a prominent role in contesting the resolution, and its ultimate defeat likely had to do with constitutional and institutional concerns about the role of Islamic law on the ground, and that an uncodified law would create enormous constitutional difficulties under the new constitution it would give too much power to the jurists, who could very well impose a form of family law that was too conservative and uncompromising for popular tastes. And with there being no legislative oversight and no judicial review, no one could do anything about it. So Resolution 137 signified the unchecked discretion of jurists to determine the law without popular input. And so this was considered anti-democratic and defeated. So moving on to talk about the judiciary, the structure of the judiciary in the Iraqi constitution is very minimal. The only formal indication of the body responsible for the interpretive tasks, and this would include all three repugnancy clauses, that no law shall contradict Islamic law, basic rights and freedoms, or democratic processes. So the only formal, the body that's responsible for this interpretive task is the Supreme Court, or the Supreme Federal Court, it's called. The Constitution says nothing about who will be on the court, whether there will be secularly trained jurists, whether they will import judges from somewhere else who have more experience interpreting these sorts of laws, both in an Islamic constitutional context. And it doesn't talk about whether it wants its judges trained in Islamic law. So resolving these questions will be a key part of what comes next for Iraq and practical considerations of the place of Islamic law there. And so there may be a fourth branch I would like to suggest, or at least one that needs to be considered, because the precise form of Islamic constitutionalism in any country will depend upon the relationship that each country develops between the government and the jurists, if the experiences of other Islamic constitutional countries in the region are to teach anything. They teach that jurists matter. In these other countries, jurists function as a kind of fourth branch, meaning that they have some sort of input into what constitutes Islamic law, or what constitutes a contradiction to Islamic law, so it's sort of phrased in a negative way. And the primary reason for this is that the formal constitution contemplates some role for the jurists by incorporating this Islamic law clause in the repugnancy clause. And this is a domain over which jurists have historically enjoyed the authority and the training that grants them legitimacy and competence to interpret the law. And that's not just insular to them, but in the eyes of the people. And so this is one of the things that Harvard professor Roy Mutahide alluded to in his comment. So any Islamic constitutional government then must figure out what relationship its formal and traditional three governmental branches will have with the jurists, if any at all. It may choose to completely exclude them, as in Turkey, which is not an Islamic constitutional country. It may incorporate them completely to the level of dominance, as in Iran, or it may devise a system of various contact between the jurists and the governmental branches, especially the judiciary, as in Morocco and Egypt. So to conclude, and we can perhaps talk about more about that when we discuss. But to conclude, while acknowledging Iraq's security problem in the present, I've tried to depict a picture or some pictures of jurists that show how and why they matter for Iraq's religious past, its unstable present, and the ideal future that we're discussing today. And as a final note, while we're on the subject of time, I just want to offer a reminder of a perspective that I'm sure everyone is aware, but perhaps a reminder is helpful. And this is something Muqtedar also, I think, alluded to. This year marks the 400th anniversary of the first American settlement in Jamestown, Virginia, which was in 1607. And our Constitution was formed and debated beginning as early as that time, and with increasing vigor in the late 18th century, or mid to late 18th century. and our Constitution was ratified in 1789, the same year, of course, as the founding of this university, it took over 2 centuries for the Constitution to emerge, and even then it was subject to a series of amendments, most importantly the Bill of Rights and the 13th and 14th Amendments a century later in 1865 and 1868, abolishing formal slavery. And it's undergoing changes to this day as we seek to make a more democratic America. So I think we do well to have that perspective in mind when considering new questions of constitutionalism, particularly in areas where external circumstances and power dynamics neither permitted the process in places like Iraq and Afghanistan to be organic nor protracted and deliberative. But we're impatient, and indeed, I do hope that a working system in this region does not take 200 years plus to emerge. But in the end, I'm glad that we're thinking about and debating these sorts of questions, and we must hope that in the end, Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere, that the people there with the power and responsibility to hammer out the details of Islamic constitutionalism are thinking about and debating the same things even more so, because ultimately they are the ones who will determine what the shape of Islamic constitutionalism will be.
I certainly want to thank Dr. Farr and the Berkeley Center for the opportunity to be on this distinguished panel. I am not an expert at all in Islam, nor do I have expertise on U.S. policy in the region or generally. As a philosopher of law, though, I have studied as carefully as I can constitutionalism and related ideas such as the rule of law, and so I approached the topic of today's panel from that perspective. Now, Dr. Khan startled me, as I suppose he startled many of you, by opening with a very important question, and he's right. Very rarely do we ask, in relation to the discussion of Iran and Afghanistan and constitutionalism in those countries, or in any other discussion, including discussions of American constitutional law in our classrooms at home and in our homes with our families and with our friends. Very rarely do we pause to ask, why do we, or even should we, value liberal democracy? We all do, at least most of us. We mean somewhat different things by the concept of liberal democracy, and we have debates about just what constitutes liberal democracy or liberal democracy of the right kind. But we really more or less assume that it is a valuable thing and should be spread. Now, I think what highlights the importance of Dr. Khan laying that question before us is the fact that most people in most places at most times have not regarded liberal democracy as the way to go. We can go all the way back to the founders of the Western philosophical tradition. Some of the most esteemed thinkers in the West, and certainly in the philosophical tradition in the West, to find rather intense criticisms of democracy and of what they did not label, but what we would today call liberal democracy or liberal dimensions of democracy. So it's a good question, and I think that I should offer an answer. Different people will answer it differently, but here's mine. I value liberal democracy because I want someone like Dr. Khan to be able to stand before an audience in the capital of the nation whose liberal democracy it is and severely criticize the government of that nation, to accuse it of engaging in rank imperialism, to declare that it has betrayed its own constitutional ideals and is operating in a rogue manner. And I want someone like Dr. Khan to be able to do that without being arrested by the officer in the back of the room or without suddenly disappearing. And I want to be able to do that in my own classroom, as I have done, sometimes criticizing the Bush administration, although not on these issues. Sometimes, more severely, I will confess, criticizing the Clinton administration. I've been able to do that, and I want to be able to do that. And I want to be able to do that not simply as a matter of my own self-will so that I can throw temper tantrums, And I want everyone else to be able to do that. I want Dr. Khan to be able to do that. Because it seems to me, on reflection, that the dignity of each of us as a person, as a possessor of certain profound, indeed one might say, godlike, literally awesome powers of reason and freedom, the dignity of such a creature requires that he be free, not only to develop his thought, consider arguments, reach conclusions, but to engage with others, to declare his positions, to debate, to discuss, critically. One would hope responsibly. It's a freedom that can be abused, but critically. So the first reason I'm for liberal democracy is because I believe it is best, it's the system that best comports with the dignity of men and women as we know them to be. And secondly, more instrumentally, it seems to me that the common good of any political society is served. In fact, I would venture to say that the common good of any political society requires that there be a free flow of communication among people and between rulers and ruled, so that the decisions that will be made will be by and large better than those that would be made in the absence of a free flow of communication. And I want people to be able to participate in the decisions that affect them, because those will be the best decisions for the society as a whole, overall and in the long run, imperfectly, not every time. And because I believe that democracy best embodies or comports with an ideal, an understanding of human dignity, which acknowledges that men and women genuinely are exemplars of these profound qualities, these powers of reason and freedom. The capacity really to be godlike in being uncaused causings. People who are capable of envisaging a possible state of affairs, acting by choice, judging it to be good, and acting by choice to bring it into being. So let me lay that before you as my own answer to Dr. Khan's very important question. Now, Dr. Khan has also raised the question of the meaning of the term liberal, noting that liberal is a dirty word in American politics. Liberals run away from the word liberal. They call themselves progressives and so forth and so on. Here, I think it's important to remember that a word like liberal or conservative, indeed even a word like Democrat or Republican, small d, small r, do not have fixed canonical meanings. They mean different things when used by different people, and they mean different things often when used by the same person in different contexts for different practical or theoretical purposes. And so I, for one, just to use myself as an example, am a severe critic of liberalism in one sense, the sense in which liberals run away from it, the sense associated with permissivism, moral laxity, and so forth and so on. But I would affirm myself as a liberal precisely in my defense of liberal democracy. I am, in one sense, a conservative against a certain form of contemporary liberalism, but in another sense, equally valid and equally important, a liberal as a believer in the rule of law, democracy, human rights, civil liberties, and so forth. So we have to be careful, and I think when we're in serious conversation, and certainly when we're writing about it, it's important to tell people what we mean when we're using the term. It's an elementary case of what your writing instructors tell you to do, define your terms. If you don't, it'll just be confused. Obviously, the term liberal means something very different in Latin American politics, indeed the opposite in some ways in Latin American politics of what it means in contemporary American politics. So I think some mysteries and puzzles disappear when we specify and try to analyze things very precisely in our use of terms. Now, I would now make a point about the nature of democracy. All three of our speakers have raised the issue of democracy and the question of the compatibility of Islam with democracy. Obviously, it's a very, very important question. I don't know the answer because I'm not a specialist on Islam, and so far as I can tell, many specialists on Islam, serious specialists on Islam, who really know Islam, also don't completely know the answer to that question. It's a question that needs to be explored, as one would have explored that same question with respect to Catholicism not very many generations ago, as the Church herself began to wrestle with the question of what constitutes democracy and whether it is in fact the way to go or whether it's destructive of the principles that the Church cherished because of its commitment to a certain ideal of human dignity. But I would say this in the hope of being helpful. When you're reflecting on that question of the relationship, the possibility, the compatibility of Islam with democracy, don't imagine that there is a platonic form of democracy out there, that democracy means one thing. There can only be one ideal form of democracy. Now, don't make the opposite error of supposing that you can call anything a democracy and that makes it a democracy. Don't embrace nominalism, as your philosophy professors at Georgetown no doubt call it. But between that relativism or nominalism and what I regard as the misguided view that there's a single, uniquely correct form of democracy, there are a range of possibilities from which reasonable people may reasonably choose. Reasonable, albeit of course mutually incompatible options. Forms of democracy that truly qualify as being in the family of democracy, but significantly differ, including differing on the question of the place of religion in public life, within limits for reasons that Professor Saunders very clearly articulated at the beginning of this panel. Certainly within limits, and certainly we want democracy not to become an idol. We only want to give 2 cheers to democracy, not 3. We would never want to assume that an outcome is correct because it's democratically validated. Democracy can be used to do evil things. There's no result. There's no guarantee that the result will be good because it's democratic. Indeed, as Pope John Paul II observed in his encyclical letter Evangelium Vitae, democracy can be used to undermine democracy. In fact, one distinguished constitutional commentator in the United States, the late Professor John Hart Ely, taught at Harvard Law School when I was there and then became dean of Stanford Law School. Ely developed a whole constitutional theory which saw the role of the judiciary fundamentally to be the protection of democracy against democratic, anti-democratic, I wasn't changing my mind, democratic, anti-democratic legislative initiatives where democracy is used to undermine democracy. So 2 cheers, not 3, for democracy. And maybe there are forms of democracy which are compatible with Islam within that family that legitimately count as truly democratic, where the public truly is participating in the decisions affecting their lives, where communication really is open and free, and where an impact can be had. Dr. Khan made a very important point, but I want to qualify it or at least nuance it. He said that the Constitution is typically an effect, not so much a cause, and effective only as an expression or codification of the popular will. There's some truth in that, but there's truth that's got to be supplemented with. And that is, it's a two-way relationship. If we look historically at constitutions, at liberal constitutions, including not only the Constitution of the United States, but certainly the Constitution of Ireland, Constitution of Germany, Constitution of Italy, and some other jurisdictions that have liberal democratic constitutions. It's certainly true that constitutions do codify popular will, but they also shape behavior. They also are causes of future behavior. They shape the nature of debates, and that's really quite critical. Madison saw this very clearly. He foresaw it, as a matter of fact, before we even had the Constitution ratified. We read his writings in the Federalist Papers. We see that he realizes that the Constitution will be an effect and an expression of popular will, and it will also shape the future. So it's important to get the Constitution right. Constitutions aren't self-executing, but they do shape things. And one of the things that they shape, for better or worse, one of the things that they shape that's absolutely critical, and Dr. Rabb mentioned this very briefly, and I think it's very important, is statesmanship. No constitution is a machine that goes of itself. There's no constitution that's going to guarantee good. I don't care how good the Constitution is, or how liberal democratic it is, or even whether it's in line with the popular will. There is no substitute for the other ingredient, which is statesmanship. If you look at the American experience, we've had successes and failures in our constitutionalism. But even if we focus on the successes, we praise our Constitution, but it's very important to notice that the Constitution isn't doing the work by itself. Critical decisions of leaders, of statesmen, have a very important role in ensuring the success of what in any society will be what the American founders called our constitutional system, which is an experiment in ordered liberty. Key decisions of Washington, George Washington, that were not dictated by the Constitution, made for the success of the American constitutional scheme. Returning power when he didn't have to give it up. Deciding to stop at 2 terms and not to go for a 3rd. We don't know actually what the consequences would have been had Washington decided not to give up power. You'll remember that the first time, I believe it was the first time, he returned power to the Congress. When word reached King George in England that Washington intended to do this, King George said, since no one else had ever done it, no, certainly no other military leader had ever done it, if he does that, he will be the most important man in the world, as indeed he ended up being. Whether there's a role for the jurists that Dr. Rabb described to us in this statesmanship, in an Islamic society, such as the ones we're talking about, well, I think that's an extremely important question. And it certainly seems to me that unless the jurists play some significant role as statesmen, of the sort that I gather Ali Sistani is trying to exercise, unless they play that, it seems to me in the cultural context, it's bound to fail. But then again, I am no expert on the sociology of these countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor George, and thanks to all of our panelists for a veritable intellectual feast. To listen to these 4 men and women think out loud about this problem, I think, is a real treat. I'm going to do something very undemocratic, and that is I'm going to add 5 minutes to our time, whether you like it or not. And I want to go directly to questions. I will ask, Sarah, are you going to hand the microphone out to people? All right, if you would please come forward and to ask your questions. And as you're doing that, I think I would like to give Professor Rabb an opportunity, briefly, please, to respond to Professor George, and perhaps to Ms. Rabb as well, given her comments about the, if you like, what appears to be the buy-in of Grand Ayatollah Ali Sistani to this thing which you believe is artificial and superficially imposed and not owned by the Iraqi people. But don't respond to that unless you prefer respond to Professor George's comments as well.
It'll take me a long time to answer, Professor George. I just wanted to clarify that I was using the word liberal in the political philosophical sense, and I was not pandering to American cultural notions of liberal permissiveness at all. And the point that I made about the European Union's rejection of the European Constitution was precisely because it's a liberal constitution. And to me, as a theorist, as a political theorist who lives on the borderlines of civilizations, it is fascinating that I can watch a society simultaneously claim to be liberal while rejecting a liberal constitution. To give you another interesting example of this same kind is this question now in Britain, where there seems to be now a truism that multiculturalism in Britain has failed because Muslims are asserting their identity, especially their cultural identity, I find it fascinating that Muslim assertion seems to take away reason from the British political thinkers, because the fact that Muslims are asserting their identity is proof that multiculturalism is working, rather than the fact that multiculturalism has failed. But this is the fear of the very good that liberal democracy promises, which is driving the rejection of liberal democracy in so-called liberal society. So my question is, when we are afraid of embracing these egalitarian values of liberalism, why are we expecting others to embrace it? I have not questioned the merit. I want us to delve on the valid. And a small point. The reason why I can stand here and speak is because I'm inconsequential. Tariq Ramadan can't stand and speak here.
Well, I might point out that Mr. Ramadan did involve himself in a conference sponsored by the Berkeley Center. He did it from Europe by teleconference, but his voice was heard.
He can't come here.
For quite a long time. But I take your point. I wonder, though, if you would respond to Ms. Rabb's observation that in Iraq, which you allege to be a country that has constitutionalism imposed upon it, it does not own this. I'm paraphrasing, I believe correctly. This has been imposed upon them, but apparently Grand Ayatollah Sistani has himself, and as a result, many others involve themselves, particularly in the fatwa that she referred to, but also the ones in which he required that people vote, and he told women of Iraq to vote on the Constitution itself, whether their husbands wanted them to or not, and they did.
Well, there are two things about Iraq. One is that I do not see Ayatollah Sistani as profoundly important to Iraqi politics and to the Shia politics as others tend to see. I envisage a major battle for legitimacy between Qom and Najaf once these things settle down. Qom is not going to give it up to Najaf so easily. There are tensions there which are much more profound. Secondly, you must understand the reason why there is an insurgency which is ongoing for so long is for the simple reason that a large element of the society has not accepted this constitution, which is the Sunnis themselves. Now, as far as Ayatollah Sistani is concerned, he has realized that he wants things to move. He says that, well, let's get these things going, put in Islam there, and then we are in majority. Democracy will always work in the favor of a majority. For example, there's religious freedom in America, but I can't practice polygamy. If this was a Muslim majority country, then we could claim there's a religious freedom available constitutionally, but also use the democratic process to privilege Islamic principles over other religious principles. So national laws can become reflections of the values of the majority if they are not specifically restricted by the Constitution. And there is nothing in the Constitution which will prevent Iraqi polity from imposing Shia values on everybody else in the country, which is very obvious from the Constitution. So Sistani got everything that he wanted. He got an Islamic state enshrined with a constitution which says that nothing in this country will be repugnant to Islam. And who gets to define? The majority. And who is the majority? The Shia. Thank you.
Professor George, did you want to respond?
We can actually date when liberal became a dirty word in American politics. It was 1972. It became a dirty word in American politics when it became associated, in the famous phrase of one commentator, with acid, amnesty, and abortion. The liberalism of Hubert Humphrey was not then and is not now a dirty word. And it's certainly not the liberalism of liberal democracy that is a dirty word in American politics. Now, we happen to have learned very recently who labeled McGovern the candidate of acid, amnesty, and abortion. It turned out to have been Thomas Eagleton, who, shortly after secretly saying that to a reporter, was named by McGovern as his running mate for vice president, and then pulled off the ticket when it turned out that he had undergone some sorts of psychiatric treatment. And as far as the Europeans are concerned, I just doubt that you're going to be able to stick the Europeans with rejecting liberal constitutionalism in their rejection of the European Constitution. Germany has not abandoned its liberal democratic constitution. Italy has not abandoned it. Ireland has not abandoned its. I think the issues that led to the rejection of the Constitution are issues that could be very easily matters of concern to people who are fully committed to liberal constitutionalism or liberal democracy. It's a range of issues having to do with economic matters and even an issue regarding the role of religion in public life and whether Europe's Christian heritage should be acknowledged. The Catholic Church in Europe, which is certainly not the force it used to be, but nevertheless is a significant force, opposed the Constitution because of its resolute adherence to the French laïcité model.
I think we are taking a lot of things for granted. For example, Germany is a country which does not even recognize Islam as a religion, constitutionally. I don't think Germany's constitution deserves to be labeled as a liberal democratic constitution. Third generation people who practice Islam are not recognized. The German constitution funds and supports churches and synagogues, rabbis and clerics of Christian persuasion are civil servants of the German Republic, and Muslims are not even recognized as constituting a religion. If you want to establish yourself as a Muslim community, you have to register as a labor union in the German Democratic or Republic or Liberal, whatever you would like to call. And so the point really is that until there is a threat to homogeneity of cultures, the real test of liberalism is when there is real questions. And I think the presence of Islam in the West, the presence of Islam in Europe, and the emergence and assertiveness of Islam in the Muslim world has threatened the West apparently so much that they would like to simultaneously assert that they are liberal while simultaneously eschewing liberal values. There are more than 10% Christians in many parts of the Muslim world, but they're not seen as existential threats. But Muslims are seen as existential threats in Europe, 3 to 4% in every country. And the reason why they are seen as existential threats is because liberal democracies will guarantee them freedom of religion, freedom of association, and freedom to assert themselves. And then they become an existential threat. And freedom of speech. For example, now in Britain, you could lock away any Muslim by taking his speech and saying he's glorifying terrorism. What a strange law. Glorifying terrorism, there is no specification as to what it means of glorifying law. Even if you say, I understand why Palestinians commit terrorism, you can liable to go to jail. So this whole idea, the point that I'm trying to make is this. I'm not saying that there is no liberalism in the West. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that in a time period when we are gradually shying away from the logical progression of liberal democracies, why are we trying to impose this on others for whom this may be culturally alien, for them, who, regardless of how desirable it is completely new? That was the question.
Okay, I'm going to let Professor George answer that, and then I'm going to ask Ms. Rabb to end our session tonight by addressing the question of whether she believes liberal democracy is possible in Iraq and in Afghanistan, but focusing on Iraq in light of what's been said. Professor George?
Yes, if Dr. Khan and I had a long conversation, we probably would agree on some points in which liberal democratic constitutions in Western nations could be improved. None is perfect. Some include very significant imperfections. But on the whole, by and large, what we have are pretty well-functioning liberal democratic regimes. And they're constitutions that should not be abandoned. If they need improvement, they should be improved. And perhaps the case that I don't know the details of the case that Dr. Khan mentioned in Germany, but I'd be interested in knowing the details. And I'd be interested in knowing whether in Germany Muslims are permitted to practice their faith or whether there's significant oppression. I do know that within sight of the Vatican, an enormous mosque is being built and that there are no complaints about it from Catholic Italians or from the Vatican or the Catholic Church. I know that if Catholics convert to Islam, they do not suffer civil disabilities as a result of that. And I think those are fruits of democratic constitutionalism, democratic liberalism, or liberal democracy. I would look forward to the day when in a place like Saudi Arabia it would be possible to build a very large Catholic church and for those of the Muslim faith who in the exercise of their freedom, choose to convert to Christianity or Judaism or some other faith, that they would suffer no civil disability.
10 seconds, Tom.
Reserve 5.
Let's let Ms. Robin. Let's let Ms. Robin.
10 seconds, I have to make it is amazing how every time you challenge the liberality of liberal democracies, the only thing that they compare themselves to is Saudi Arabia.
That was 13 seconds.
I think I have a little bit of a different view from one major theme that we've been discussing, which is the compatibility of Islam and democracy. Islam is a religion, and it entails a set of things, including laws and ritual practice, belief, spirituality, and that sort of thing. It's not a political system per se, and it doesn't designate a specific political system, particularly in the face of democracy. There was no political system at the time of Islam's advent that was democratic. Of course, you can find democratic principles, perhaps, in some scholars of Islamic history and law have looked to Islamic history to try to find roots of democracy there. But Islam itself, as a religion, does not mandate a political system. And so on this question of the compatibility and whether or not there is a possibility of a functioning Islamic constitutional democratic society, I think that there are a lot of questions that remain open, and that's one of the central points that I wanted to make, is that there are certainly forms of democracy like the Saudi Arabia forms of state. Let me not say that, but forms of state governance and institutions like the Saudi Arabia that was just mentioned, that or Iran for that matter, that are going to be very thick forms of Islamic rule and Islamic constitutionalism, if you want to call it that. Although in the case of Saudi Arabia, it's explicitly not a democracy, whereas Iran claims to be. And then there are going to be thin forms of Islamic constitutionalism where Islam or Islamic law does not dominate or overwhelm the polity. And then there are going to be a host of things in between. And as Dr. George mentioned about statesmanship, leadership, and that sort of thing, these are questions that are going to have to be worked out and resolved and put into balance, both according to the terms of the Constitution, which lists these three things: Islamic law, basic rights and freedoms, and democratic processes, and the people who put them into play, perhaps along with the jurists.
Well, terrific. On that hopeful note, let's end this tonight, and let's thank our panelists, and also thanks to you for being so patient. Thank you all for coming, and good night.
Did I take it? It's better.